Hello and welcome to this La Trobe University podcast on Troy and the Trojan War. My name is Sarah Midford and I'm a Research Associate in Mediterranean Studies at La Trobe University, and I'm joined today by Professor Chris Mackie, the Head of School of Humanities and resident expert in all things Troy. Today we're going to talk about the ancient city of Troy and the mythical Trojan War. So, Chris, let's start with the question of where the ancient city is located and whether the actual city of Troy existed at all.
Well, we think it existed. It's most likely located, as you see there on the map, on the west of Turkey, not far from a lot of Greek islands there. It's a very interesting area in all sorts of ways. You'll see there are a lot of other cities located, not just Troy, but also Abydos and Sestos. There's myths associated with that, and a lot of other cities that don't find their way onto that map. Across that waterway, the Dardanelles waterway, is the Gallipoli Peninsula, which Australians, of course, know very well. And in antiquity, that particular location was home for about 12 cities as well. So people should think about this area as not just having Troy located in it, but a lot of other cities as well. But Troy, if students occasionally ask me, do you think the city of Troy exists? I mean, do we have the city of Troy where it's supposed to be there? And I think probably most people are comfortable with the answer yes, which brings up all sorts of other questions like, was there a Trojan War? And we can maybe look at that a little bit later. But yes, I think that is the case. And for those who read the ancient texts, you can see there Mount Ida, which is a favourite location of mine. That's in Homer's Iliad. That's located right close to Troy. But as you can see there, the physical remains are quite a long way away. So,
and what's the significance of Mount Ida? What happened there?
Well, Mount Ida, Zeus resides on Mount Ida, and he keeps a watch. He watches the Trojan War from Mount Ida. So it's a sacred site, but it's also, for the Trojans, kind of their mountain. They get their wood there for cremations. All the rivers start on Mount Ida. It's a very rich, fertile area. I mean, even now, if you travel there, it's a very rich and fertile area. But certainly in the ancient texts, it's a place of great importance in terms of in all sorts of ways. And of course, the judgment of Paris, which begins the Trojan War, takes place up on Mount Ida. So it's a very important site in terms of the identity of Troy. And indeed, there is a myth that Dardanus founded the original city up on Mount Ida, and then gradually they moved towards the coast and set up the city of Troy. So there's a lot of myths associated with this area, and so the geography of the area is very rich in terms of its mythological descriptions and all that sort of thing.
And its physical location, it's actually, what we're seeing on the map here is actually partially European and partially Asian, isn't it? So is that significant as well?
Well, it is, because in many of the myths, the Trojans are perceived to be Asian by the Greeks and the Romans, and therefore the Greeks, when they attack the city of Troy, are going from Europe to Asia, and right through. I mean, we're looking at this subject at Virgil's Aeneid, and sometimes the Trojans are depicted as very Asian, very different from what a Greek or a Roman might be like, and so wearing perfume and all this. If you wanted to be disparaging towards a Trojan, just describe them as an Asian or something like that. Yes, and that distinction between Europe and Asia is very important in antiquity, because when, for instance, Xerxes attacks Greece in the early 5th century BC, he's crossing that line from Asia into Europe, and the Greek writers and poets are very strong on this. Is almost like breaking a divine boundary and so forth. And
I love the story of Xerxes with the boats that he puts together and makes a bridge.
Makes a bridge, and then a storm comes and wrecks it, and we're supposed to believe that that Xerxes then executed the bridge builders, and then got some more, and they did it properly this time, and so forth. But particularly the Greek writers in the 5th century BC are very big, very strong on this idea that The Dardanelles waterway there, between what's the Thracian Chersonese and the Asian side, is like a divine boundary. It's a big part of their thinking.
All right, well, I'm going to move on to the next slide, which is a picture I took myself, and Chris and I actually had a bit of an argument beforehand as to who took this picture, because it's obviously a common picture, lots of people have it. So do you want to discuss what we're seeing here?
Yeah, this is taken from Troy. I presume it's from the Temple of Athena at Troy, and you'll find out soon enough when you go and work there. But it's a fantastic slide because it just captures how close Troy is to the Gallipoli Peninsula. You'll see there that the land is about, the waterway is about 3 or 4 kilometres from where the city of Troy currently is. Now that isn't the way it is in the literary versions, and in fact what's happened through natural processes is that the land has built up, and so that the Dardanelles is now about 4 kilometres away through sediment and all sorts of issues like that. So those people who know the story of Troy in the main literary versions, you have the city of Troy, and then the waterway is really, the idea is it's really, really close, and that's probably the way it was in antiquity. And certainly in Homer and Virgil and these sorts of things, the water is very close indeed, and the battlefield is kind of situated between where the 1,000 ships are meant to be, or how many ships are meant to be, and the city and so forth. So it's quite distinct now, but it's very if you go to this area today, it's a very rich area. It's very agricultural area. In antiquity, this whole region was perceived as a bit of a breadbasket for the growing of crops.
I've spent quite a lot of time in this area, living in Troy and living around Troy and the region, and I can tell you that the food is still very good. The tomatoes especially.
Yeah, and really, you can see there just how rich it is in olives and wine, grapes and so forth. It's a beautiful area.
It's cheese country now, I think. Country. Yeah, Xena is cheese country. So. Now, there's a very famous archaeologist associated with Troy because it was lost for centuries, wasn't it? And in 1871, Heinrich Schliemann came and, well, I'll let you tell the story.
Well, Schliemann's a very controversial figure. He was a very brilliant man, linguistically just unbelievable how quickly he picked up languages. His one of his wives was a Greek girl called Sophie, and they used to converse in ancient Greek together and things like that. Well, anyone who's learned ancient Greek will just know how difficult that is and so forth. But there are stories about the fact that he could pick up languages in a matter of weeks and so forth. He's a very brilliant man. He's a very wealthy man, businessman, makes a lot of money in his life, and rather obsessed, a bit like you and me, with the Homer's Iliad and the story of Troy and so forth. And he makes a major mark in discoveries both on the mainland of Greece and at Troy in the 1860s and 1870s in particular. Archaeology as a sort of a systematic scientific pursuit is really only getting going, and so today for modern archaeologists he's not really considered probably an archaeologist at all, and there you can see his trench, destructive, it's like driving a bulldozer through and so forth. So, but he does some major work in identifying sites like Mycenae and Troy, Tiryns and these sorts of places, and so he's, but always this sort of dodgy question mark about his work and the veracity of what he finds and so forth. Often wrong in identifying material that isn't in the period that it's supposed to be and so forth. Both at Mycenae and Troy. Also, an unbelievable self-promoter. And there are others like Frank Calvert and so forth who probably could lay a claim to being the finder, the discoverer of Troy. And not Schliemann at all. But Schliemann created his own myth. At times he was incredible, because this is a period where the classics were incredibly popular in particularly among the educated elite, and he was particularly close friends with William Gladstone, the British Prime Minister, and so forth. So he moved in major circles in Germany and in England and so forth, and promoted himself invented himself, I suppose, as the discoverer of Troy, and he played a major part in that.
Well, he was kind of obsessed with the Iliad and with the Odyssey, went searching for Ithaca, which is the home of Odysseus, and apparently he, instead of reading the Bible at his child's christening, because he was only christened under duress, I believe, and he put the Iliad on the child's head and read 100 lines of Homer.
As
you do, yeah.
So yes, and there's all sorts of backstories around some of this. He did things quite often illegally. I think he took material. No question about that.
We smuggled the gold out.
He smuggled stuff, got it out to Germany, and ended up in Russia. In the war. So all sorts of, you and I have been on the Gallipoli Peninsula. He conducted an excavation there of
it's a similar looking trench, actually.
Of a tomb of a guy called Petersen, and then he got caught by the Turkish authorities, and they shipped him back and so forth. So he was, quite an interesting character.
Well, I guess the next thing we need to talk about is the historicity of Troy, whether it's myth, it's folklore, is it history? I mean, where does this story fit? Right.
Well, my own view is that there were, I think, on the archaeological evidence, historical struggles for the city of Troy. And if you look at the location of the city of Troy, it's right at the entrance to the Dardanelles. And so you can sort of see the way that these cities would have used that location to get lots of money and make charges and use themselves as a base for people going north or south and so forth. So there was probably, my own view is that there was probably a struggle, various struggles there, and that one particular struggle entered into the world of the poets, the oral poets, who clearly could well have existed since the time of Troy in the late Bronze Age. We're talking a period here that the Trojan War is, if you say that it was a historical event, it's probably meant to be about 1100 BCE. And so people might want to think about the possibility of a struggle for the city around 1100 BC, which is picked up by the poets at some point, and probably into the realm of myth in a broader sense. And then it enters more fully, and it becomes the quintessential war myth, when the Greek poets and then the Roman poets like to refer to this narrative, this story of the war for Troy, to explore the human condition to some degree and what humans do to one another in war. Bearing in mind that in the ancient Greek world, there's not just the Iliad and the Odyssey. There must have been a whole series of poems based around the Trojan War, each of them taking little sections of the Trojan War. And the Trojan War, of course, is a struggle not just between human beings, between Trojans and Greeks, but also between gods. So the Greeks give it a divine. It's a struggle between the Olympian gods, and so some of them line up with Troy and some of them line up with the Greeks and so forth. So there may well have been a historical struggle for the city of Troy, but then what epic poets do is that they build it up and they exaggerate it and they idealise it. We know this from more recent epics like the Song of Roland and so forth, the French epic, and it was a struggle for a one-day battle, but it gets turned into something much bigger, and in all likelihood that's what happened here. I mean, people when they go to Troy, maybe Sarah, you have a view on this, but people go to the site of Troy in the west of Turkey, and they often very disappointed because they go to those cities down the west coast. And then they come to Troy and they're thinking, this is the big one. Actually, but when you get there, it's quite a small site.
Well, if you go to Pergamum first and Ephesus and then you end up in Troy, I mean, it's a wonderful pile of rocks, but in some ways it is a pile of rocks.
And people are very disappointed. But in a way, that's what... That's because an epic poet like Homer and all the others that followed him, including Virgil at Rome, have just built it up so that the historicity and historical reality of the city and the myths surrounding it and describing it are quite distinct and quite different. Yeah,
absolutely. I guess we should talk about Homer. We've touched on epic poetry, and I want to start with the quintessential question about Homer is, did he write the Iliad? Is Homer the author of the Iliad?
Well, could Homer write? That's the question. Well, the short answer is it's the famous Homeric question that we know virtually nothing about Homer. We've got little snippets from later poets, and a lot of Homeric scholarship in universities conducted around the world is looking into how the Homeric poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, come to be, what lies behind them, both in other oral traditions and epic poems and so forth. And so, as you can imagine, there's a lot of speculation. All we know is that the Iliad seems to be the oldest literature in Western Europe. Let's think of it like that. And it comes a bit like a bolt from the blue. This magnificent poem of about 16,000 lines, and it kind of comes from a bolt like the blue. And some people would say it's never been surpassed as a piece of literature and so forth. My own view is that the poet, let's call him Homer, pulled together. And this is what they call a Unitarian view, pull together all this epic poetry, all this verse that he must have had in his head and so forth, and creates his version of this magnificent poem. That there must have been some kind of monumental poet who, because it's an absolutely brilliant piece of work, and I find it very, some of the other views where there is no monumental poet, I find that pretty hard to believe and so forth. So I think people should think of it in those terms. And also questions like, could Homer write? Because we're talking about a poet that probably lived around 700 BCE, possibly about 450 years after the original conflict, if there was one. And so, there's all that oral tradition that he pulls in. Now, those students in the subject who are working on Virgil's Aeneid, I'll say a bit more about Virgil's Aeneid in a moment, that particular poet, Virgil, in the late 1st century BCE, is creating his poem, the Aeneid, at a rate of about 3 lines a day. So you're dealing with a very different kind of world. Homer, 700 BCE or thereabouts, possibly with skills in writing, possibly not. Virgil from 70 to 19 BCE, but definitely using writing to create his poem. And so that those two poets live in very different worlds, even though the one is kind of emulating the other.
Of course. So we've segued nicely into Rome. Perhaps we should talk about the significance of Troy and the Trojan War to the Romans, because to me it's a Greek epic, isn't it?
So the story of Troy is what they call a pan-Hellenic expedition, where all the Greeks attack this city. There's no Greece as such. What you've got is a lot of city-states, and so they attack this city, and Homer and the Greek poets describe what happens in this particular war. There is an obscure reference in the Iliad to the fact that Aeneas is going to escape from the city of Troy. Aeneas, a Trojan, he's going to escape, and he has a future elsewhere.
So it's a sequel.
Yeah. So, but Homer never mentions Rome or anything like that. But he just says Aeneas is going to move on and do something different and so forth. it's impossible to exaggerate just how strongly influenced Roman culture was by Greek literature, Greek philosophy, Greek art, Greek thought generally, and the Romans buy into this myth by making themselves, I suppose you'd say, by seeing themselves as the survivors of Troy. And the idea is that Aeneas leads the surviving Trojans away from Troy on a long kind of Mediterranean trip, and finally they leave Troy. They sail down through the Greek islands to Crete, and then finally to North Africa and Sicily and so forth, and finally they come to the south of Italy, and then to the site of Rome, and the idea is that they establish the city of Rome from the ashes of Troy. And there's all these other complicating myths which I won't go into here, including one that where actually Troy was founded by Rome, by Dardanus came from Italy and went to Troy, and then now Aeneas is coming back from Troy to Italy and so forth. So it's very, very complex, and but that in a nutshell is what we're talking about. We are talking, it's a bit like the Phoenix bird, we're talking about this great new city that dominates the Mediterranean world and far beyond, originally coming from Troy, and
rising from the
ashes and so forth.
Lovely. And they bring the flame too, don't they? That's part of the myth.
Yeah, and they bring bring all those household gods, and there's a whole story about this. It's a major. It's a major story, but and Virgil's Aeneid is really, it's a kind of foundation myth. The first 6 books are based around kind of an odyssey, kind of a wandering sort of narrative of wandering through the Mediterranean, looking for their home. And because they don't know where their home is meant to be, they're looking. They go to these places. They go to Crete, and they go to Delos, and they go to various places, North Africa, and finally they
get stuck with women as well.
Yeah, with Dido, and Aeneas has a fling with Dido along the way, and so forth. So, but yes, ultimately they reach Italy, and then the site of Rome. They have a struggle with various peoples, Etruscans and indigenous Italians and so forth, and that's the second half of the Aeneid, which is often thought of to be kind of based around the Iliad. So, in those years, from about 30 BCE to 19 BCE, when he dies, Virgil seems to want to create an epic poem that pulls together the Iliad and the Odyssey, which is a pretty bold. It's a bit like you or me trying to emulate Shakespeare or something. It's a pretty bold thing that he does, and he does a pretty good job of it. It's a 12-book epic poem. It's very dense, but the mythical subject matter, it's a foundation myth, the foundation of Rome from the ashes of Troy.
And it's a really interesting time period that it's been written in as well, because it's being written after the fall of the Republican period. So the imperial period has started, and Augustus is installed as the first emperor, whether or not he's called emperor at the time, princeps. But I mean, do you want to talk a little bit about the significance of the timing of this epic?
Well, that's right, because the idea is that Augustus is creating a kind of new Rome, I suppose, in all sorts of ways. And Augustus, one of the big things about Roman literature, and those people who are looking at Catullus or Horace or other poets will know this, that the idea of patronage is a very important one at Rome. And Virgil managed to get himself the best possible well, he actually has a few, but certainly Augustus is one of those. So one of the great questions hanging over the Aeneid is to what degree is this a political favour for Augustus? And to what degree is it not a political favour to Augustus? So we know Augustus provides support, physical, monetary support for Virgil. Virgil, by the way, comes from the north of Italy, up near Mantova. A lot of these Roman poets don't come from Rome; they come from other parts. Catullus comes from Verona, and Ovid comes from Sulmona and so forth. So they're all attracted to Rome, and
that's where the patrons are.
That's where the patrons are. That's where the money is. That's where the prestige is. And Virgil comes to Rome, and certainly he acquires the patronage of Augustus. But the poem has to be read fairly carefully, and it's a period of transition, as you mentioned, from a republic where no single person totally dominates in the way that they do later on, and so Augustus is a very important figure in this sort of transitional phase from the what we think of as the late republic into the early empire.
And the other thing about Augustus is that he traces his lineage to Aeneas, to Venus, through Romulus and Remus. So when Augustus is actually setting himself up as the emperor, as the princeps, he is doing so with the legitimacy of divine heritage.
That's right. I mean, it's good to have a god in your family tree. I mean, that's always a good thing. And throughout antiquity, people were wanting to associate themselves with particular heroes, particular gods. And Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar did that with Venus, Aphrodite, and Aphrodite or Venus, Aphrodite is a Greek name, Venus the Roman name, is the mother of Aeneas. There's a story behind that, which, one night stand that we won't talk about here, but basically she is the mother of Aeneas. And therefore it has all sorts of resonances with the claims that people like Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar are making about their heritage.
And I love the fact that both of them, Julius Caesar and Augustus, actually make a pilgrimage to Troy to pay their respects. Well,
the fascinating thing about that is right through, I mean, even Xerxes, the Persian king in Herodotus, is meant to go to Troy. Roman emperors, as you say, go to Troy. Right through history, people have gone to Troy.
Alexander.
Almost like Alexander's another one. Plutarch tells us Alexander went there just before he went off to his grand journey of conquest in the east, and he goes to Troy and he runs a race naked. And does all sorts of things like that. And so right through time, it quickly acquires a kind of a sanctity or, such incredible importance, not least because of Homer's and other writers' sensational poetry on the subject. I like to think of that in the context too of the way that Gallipoli has become a kind of a site of site of great importance for
and pilgrimage
for people, say in the Australian context anyway, because of what happened there in 1915. And so you're seeing a sort of similar phenomenon of a different kind of battle site acquiring special status.
That's right, and both of you and I do research on the fact that there is this connection between Troy and Gallipoli.
Well, that's right, and a lot of people don't realise that there's a lot of archaeology done in 1915 when they were digging trenches and the like, and that they come on a lot of material. So the First World War was, in many ways, particularly with the British and the French and the Australians and so forth in Gallipoli in 1915, there was this consciousness that they, among some of the poets, that they were going to the fields, Rupert Brooke and these sorts of guys, that they were going to the fields of Troy. They weren't going to the fields of Troy at all. They were going to to Gallipoli, which is across the waterway, but it's close enough.
Yeah.
And
Technically, they could see it.
yeah, and bear in mind, as we've been seeing, Schliemann is excavating in the early 1870s. The First World War is the Gallipoli campaign is 1915.
It's not that far apart.
So it's topical.
Yeah.
And people are really amazed that this is a period of great archaeological work, not just in Troy, around Troy, but elsewhere in Crete and other places like that. So it's very topical, and so a lot of people go to this part of the world in 1915 very conscious of what its cultural significance.
Absolutely. I should mention at this point that that the archaeology of the region, it doesn't end with the Trojan War, with the period of the Trojan War. I mean, the Romans went and built a city on top. And
if you go to Troy today, you can see the Roman period well established there, and it's very much so. I mean, it was a site of cultural significance. And of course, the Romans dominate the whole region in the period, from the 2nd century BC.
Well, they rename it Ilion, I think, at that time. Yeah.
Ilion, I'd say.
And it's called Troya, or Truva in Turkish, and it's still being excavated today. And I'm lucky enough to be going on an excavation there in 3 weeks' time.
I'm very envious. I'd love to be there myself.
Yeah, so and we'll be looking at the much later periods and probably the areas outside of the walled part of the city in the fields. So beyond the walls of Troy and the everyday life stuff.
Yeah. Well, as we've seen, you can see the two land, Gallipoli and Troy, they're quite close to one another.
We'll be in Gallipoli later in the year as well.
That's correct.
And we should probably move on to the Trojan Horse. I mean, this is the icon of Troy that everyone is familiar with. I mean, you'd be difficult.
Yeah, so if you go to Troy today, you can be in certain parts of the site and you can look out and you can see the horses.
This is the original horse?
This is the original.
Oh, excellent.
No, it's not really. But the Turkish authorities decided to build this horse. Some people find it very tacky.
It's great fun to climb inside, though.
You can climb inside, but those who don't know the myth, the wooden horse was the means by which the Greeks entered the city, because the walls of Troy are meant to be built by the gods, so you can't knock them down. So the idea is that you need some way of entering into the city, and Odysseus comes up with the idea of the wooden horse. The men hide inside. The Trojans are convinced to pull the horse into the city, and then of course they escape at night and so forth. So it's a very important myth, a slightly puzzling myth. People think it might have been, a mythic version of a sort of a siege engine or something like that. The fact that it's a horse is very important because Troy is a very horsey place in the myth and probably in life and so forth. So it's a city that's closely associated with the running of horses, with special divine horses and so forth.
And they talk too, don't they?
And they talk and so forth. Horses are very important in the heroic identity. If you go back to the Iliad, Achilles has divine horses, the best horses, all that sort of thing. So I couldn't go through the importance of the horse in the Troy myth, but just if you take my word for it, and I think probably that has a lot to do with the fact that it's a wooden horse, not a wooden cow or wooden something other.
So the fact that the horse is a horse and not a cow is significant, because this is sort of something that's sacred to Troy, destroying Troy.
Yeah, I mean, my sneaking suspicion is that the fact that it's a horse relates to an earlier myth where Heracles sacked the city because he didn't get some divine horses that the king of Troy had. That's a fairly obscure myth and may not be right, but the fact that it's a horse, I think, is really very interesting and important. And the myth makers, whoever came up with this idea, I mean, could have been anything, but they came up with the idea of a wooden horse and so forth. And Odysseus, who dreams up the idea, notice it's Odysseus that really sacks the city of Troy. Odysseus comes up with the idea, and it's this idea of wars are won through intellect. The city of Troy in the myth of the Greeks and the Romans falls because this guy comes up with an idea. It's not Achilles that sacks the city, running around the walls with spears and all that sort of thing. It's Odysseus that sacks the city. And to me, that's a reference to the fact that wars through time have been won through cleverness, through invention, through all those sorts of things. And
yeah,
so
and
it's
he
a
gets
very
in.
important,
Yeah,
and he gets
he
in.
gets in.
And they sack the city. It's a very important myth, but it doesn't exist in the Iliad because the Iliad deals with a different part of the war. It doesn't, but a very important source that we're reading is Aeneid Book 2, where this is dealt with in the most powerful literary way you can imagine.
Yeah, it's a wonderful book. It's a really wonderful book to read. And it gives us the story of what happens once the horse gets inside, and the sort of the destruction of the city from within. And fire plays a really crucial role in that.
Yeah, indeed. Odysseus is the key person, and I forgot to mention that Odysseus is a kind of hero who comes into his own in the confines, in the dark confines. So many of his myths are confinement myths, where he's in the darkness, like in the womb of this horse, other ones where he's in a tomb with Polyphemus and so forth. But they steal out in the middle of the night, and then they attack the Trojan guards and defeat the city and burn the city. And in Virgil's treatment in Aeneid 2, which, as I say, is the best version in terms of credible story, it's the burning of the city that really strikes you. There's a lot of fire symbolism, fire descriptions, and the burning city. And the idea in the myth of Troy is that it has a life. It has a lifespan, a bit like a person does. Mm-hmm. And at the end of that lifespan, Troy is burnt. Troy is cremated a little bit like a hero is cremated, and that's a very important idea in this story.
Because the end of Book 24 of the Iliad is about burial and funerals and ceremonial.
Yeah, Hector is cremated, and the idea is, and this comes quite strongly in the film Troy, Wolfgang Petersen film. At the very end, Hector is burnt on the pyre, and in Homer's, it's the very end of the Iliad. In Homer's sense, that anticipates the burning of the city. So the burning of the city is a very important idea in terms of the end of life. And as we know, it arises again from the ashes, as it were, through Aeneas going to Italy. But it's the fire idea is very important.
And that's why it's so important that Virgil tells this story, I suppose, so that there can be a rising from the ashes.
Absolutely.
Well, you mentioned the film, and I think we should talk about it in a little bit of detail. I've got a lovely picture there of the horse that's...
Brad
Pitt's horse, that's right. And that's in the centre of Çanakkale, which is the closest city to the Trojan Archaeological Park. So, I mean, what did you think of the film? Did you think it was a good rendition of this epic that you love so much? Diplomatic answer, maybe?
Diplomatic answer. I thought it was very interesting for those students who have seen the film, or I mean, easily acquired if you haven't seen it. It's very interesting that the filmmaker, Wolfgang Petersen, decided to deal with the story of Troy from the very beginning. Actually, it's not the very beginning, but it's close enough to the beginning, where Helen and Paris are in Sparta together, and then they steal off together. They have a fling, and then they're off to Troy, which as we know, brings about the Trojan War. So the film starts there and goes all the way to the end of the city and Aeneas running off to found Rome.
I always expected a sequel, like the Aeneid, the sequel.
The sequel. And maybe it'll happen. Yeah. But no Greek, or probably even Roman poet might, but no Greek poet would do that. No Greek poet would ever try to take the whole myth of the city from the very beginning or this war from the very beginning with Helen and Paris right up to the destruction of the city. Homer doesn't do that. Homer in the Iliad just takes about 40 odd days, a short period in the war, and deals with it, but anticipates the destruction of the city and looks back on its history, but would never take you all the way through. And so, in answer to your question, I got quite exhausted after about an hour in that film because it was moving at such pace that one became a little bit exhausted. But you can see why he has to do it that way, because he's dealing with an audience who probably, not like me or not like you, don't deal with this stuff very much. And so you've got to, people would naturally ask, well, why is this war going on? Well, if you see Helen and Paris at the very beginning, you know why the war's taking place. And so it's much more difficult for a filmmaker in 2013 or in our world to do that, rather than an epic poet of 700 BC, where his audience know the story. They don't need to be told who Helen is, who Paris is, how the war started, what happened, all that sort of thing. So an epic poet, just like a dramatic poet in antiquity, can anticipate a thorough awareness of a myth, and therefore just do it the way he wants to do it.
Yeah, and I think that there's an element of just different types of storytelling as well, the storytelling of antiquity and the storytelling of today. And one of the really good examples of that is the omission of the gods from this film. I mean, do you have any thoughts on why he didn't? Because the gods are so important in the Iliad.
Yeah, they certainly are. I guess Petersen would. I saw an interview with him, and he said I didn't want to have gods like that, because he referred to there's a film, Jason and the Argonauts, which was made in the 1960s, and Zeus and the gods are sitting up there on Mount Olympus, and it's like they're playing chess with people, and there's a dry ice and all that sort of thing, and it's you can look at it today and have an absolute hoot. And he said he didn't want to go there, and I think that is a tendency. You and I were talking with David Malouf about ransom and so forth, but there is a tendency for modern receptions of this myth to take out the gods as, in some ways, a slightly trivial part of Homer. It's obviously not the way I see it, and I think a lot is lost by taking out the gods. But I suppose that's just an inevitable consequence of people
can't really deal with the narrative stops being real or plausible if there's gods in it, perhaps.
I would love to see somebody have a go.
Yeah.
I would love to see somebody
there you go.
make a film of either of the Iliad or the Troy myth or what have you, and try to somehow to leave the gods in the Homeric way. I'd be very interested to see it. It might be perceived as ridiculous. Maybe
You've got to give it a go.
You don't want people going to see a film version of Homer's Iliad and having them laughing through the...
No.
It's probably not a good look, so, maybe that's the danger if you get it wrong.
Yes,
like that.
True.
So.
Well, I guess we should talk a bit more generally about the cultural legacy that Troy and the Trojan War and the myth of this event has left in our society. I mean, it's predominantly a Western legacy. I mean, do you want to sort of talk about the importance of this story?
Well, I suppose I deal with it in a number of ways, as we've talked about in the Gallipoli literature, the cinematic tradition. I am constantly struck by... in fact, somebody sent me a blog the other day where a woman, I think in America, has a Trojan War blog. She spent 11 years, the last 11 years...
It's longer than the Trojan War.
Yeah, the last 11 years working on pulling in material on the Trojan War for her blog and so forth.
All right. Good on her.
And so, but I'm constantly struck at the way that this myth, I mean, not just big horses sitting in cities and things like that, but the way that very often young children relate to this myth. It has a sort of an eternal quality about it, as the, you know, and so many different aspects to it. But it's you know, I've supervised students who've looked at the Troy myth in children's literature.
It's very popular in children's literature, isn't it? I mean, it's got some great props. The horse that can hold thousands of men, and
it has. And this can sometimes be a problem too, because Greek mythology is very violent.
Yes.
And Greek and Roman mythology is very, very violent, and it's not really a story that was intended for children as such. It was, you know, adults engaged with this. It wasn't for children. So you do with the Troy myth, you sometimes have to tone down the violence and so forth. But there's no doubt that children engage with this myth in a huge sort of way. And
do you have any inkling as to why that might be? What it is about the core of this story that is so retellable?
I have lots of thoughts on that. It's very hard to encapsulate it in a...
Put you on the spot, I'm sorry.
I think it goes back to the brilliance of Homer, and the way that the poets and the artists, we haven't even talked about the artists, but the way that the poets and the artists and the myth makers build on this through time. I think it includes ideas about that quintessential hero figure of Achilles and everything that he exemplifies and so forth. I think it's the capacity to, but the story of Troy is really a life and death story, and the way that all those great questions of human existence are dealt with in a war context. And unfortunately, war is a perennial, but the poets dealt with this it's a genocide narrative, really. And the human dimension is enormous. And, you know, you can read parts of Homer, Virgil, and just, you know, it's quite harrowing at times. You know, you think of this little boy, Astyanax, Hector's son, who's going to be thrown from the walls and die. And there's, you know, it's a very powerful story. So I think it enhances the human capacity to engage with literature and myth and war. So
there's something extreme about war that allows you to sort of take out archetypes of humanity and sort of play them out in a bubble, I guess, which I think is really interesting, and has been picked up, obviously. And as we were saying, you know, the Gallipoli myths pick that up as well in Australia and abroad. Well, I think that we've covered quite a lot today. I think we've
run over time.
Maybe perhaps we've even run over time. But I'd like to thank you all for listening, and I'd also encourage you to join the conversation. We have a Facebook account and we have a Twitter page. So if you want to get involved and you want to comment on anything we've said here today, or anything to do with the ancient Roman world, which is currently on iTunes U, or anything about the ancient world in general, please join us. And thank you very much for sticking around right to the end. Cheers.